Very happy you could attend this webinar today. Just some housekeeping notes. Please mute your microphones. You can, at the end of the presentation, we'll open it up for questions. You can unmute yourself, or you can type your questions into the chat box out there, and we'll be monitoring the chat box also. This webinar and the recording, we are recording this presentation. Both will be posted on our website. And we can go through it after the webinar to show you where we post the presentation. On all our presentations are there on our website, so you can access that after the close of the webinar. So with that, let me hand it over to Simon, and she can introduce us. Simon, all yours. Simon, you're on mute.
Yes, actually, I think Bernadette is going to introduce Russ.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Thanks. So Russ Hyatt is a project engineer in Geosyntec's Brooklyn, New York office with 12 years of experience in environmental consulting. So he is coming to us and broadcasting out of Brooklyn. He specializes in sustainable solid waste management, and he has supported confidential clients with developing sustainable packaging strategies for products sold in plastic and glass bottles, and compliance with extended producer responsibility legislation in the US and Canada. He has a master's degree at Columbia University in sustainable management, and he focused on material management, including frameworks for implementing a circular economy. He's conducted extensive research in municipal solid waste streams in the state of Washington and Oregon, and has tracked municipal solid waste from curbside pickup to final disposition at landfills serving these states. He has evaluated beneficial end-use placement options for dredge materials through conducting environmental footprint analysis, and has extensive experience working with the waste management industry in identifying suitable beneficial use options for dredge material. I'm going to turn it over to Russ. It sounds like it's going to be a very interesting topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for joining in. And we'll just dive right in. I know we've got about an hour here. I want to leave time for questions. You know, as we just discussed, I'm going to be talking about the new SB54, the new EPR bill for packaging that just came out in California, and how that bill, you know, what the potential impacts will be from that bill. And I'll just say Simon is controlling the slides. Some of them have animation, or not animations, but just like the, you know, the clicks. We could just go, I'll just have to continue to tell you to kind of go next slide, or next click even. So apologies for the issues I'm having with my computer, but you can go to the next slide. So this is big. SB54 is here. Governor Gavin, excuse me, I'm having even more technical problems. I apologize. Bear with me 2 minutes. Actually, it's perfect timing because the sirens are coming by right now. Okay, backing up and going. Okay, so SB54 is here, and it's a major bill. It's going to have a lot of impacts, and so I'm really glad that everybody is joined in here. Governor Gavin Newsom just signed. It's called the Pollution Prevention and Packaging Producer Responsibility Act into law on June 30th. So just, you know, over a month ago. And it's really gonna change things in California. You can go to the next slide. So what we're gonna do today, we're gonna go through, you know, what is EPR, you know, the concept of extended producer responsibility. I'm going to just assume that most of you are not aware of that concept yet, haven't learned it. So we're going to really just start at the beginning. And then we're going to talk about what the status is of EPR legislation for packaging in the US. And then why are we doing this? Why are these packaging EPR bills coming to the US? Then we're going to go into key terms in typical packaging EPR legislation, kind of a vocabulary lesson before we dive into SB54 and learn about those, the plan, the specifics of that bill, and then what the environmental impacts might be. You can go to the next slide. So extended producer responsibility is, it's not a new concept. It is around since the 90s, even for packaging in other countries. Extended producer responsibility has been in the US, even California, for instance, has extended producer responsibility bill or laws in place for handling materials like mattresses, typically cans, things like that, things that are difficult on the end of life side of things to manage from its physical or chemical characteristics. So I'm from New York, but being that I'm presenting to everybody in California, I pulled this section from Cal Recycle of extended producer responsibility. I'll just read it. I promise this will probably be the only thing I'm reading from a slide, but it's a strategy to place a shared responsibility for end-of-life product management on producers and other entities involved in the product chain instead of the general public, while encouraging product design changes that minimize the negative impacts on human health and the environment at every stage of the product's life cycle. So it's basically just putting the burden on the producers to deal with financially funding and also to some extent managing the end of life of their products, particularly packaging in the case that we're going to see. So this is going to create a setting for markets to emerge that reflect the environmental impacts of a product. So it's really a means for policymakers to pull levers to encourage and incentivize change by the producers. You can go to the next slide. So the status of packaging EPR in the US is really exciting and something that when I came on at Geosyntec, I was brought on to look into or to assist with some of our clients with because there's this wave of packaging EPR bills coming into the US. And you see here the map that it's about in 2022, there were 17 states that have proposed EPR packaging legislation. Actually, I think in 2021, there was over 30 or 35, so a little less, but there were some big hits in 2022. So in 2021, it was Maine and Oregon passed their packaging EPR laws, and then in 2022, it was California and as well as Colorado. Now there is a federal legislation that is kind of floating around there. It's unlikely to pass. It's called the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, but that one's unlikely to pass. And so it's really at the state level where we're looking at these EPR bills. You can go to the next slide. So the driving factors for packaging EPR legislation, I'm not going to go into specifics here because I'll touch on it more so when we talk about the impacts of the bill towards the end of the presentation. Really, one is the fragmentation of the recycling reg. It says regulations here, rules. So by that I mean it's very confusing as a consumer to know what's to be recycled and what cannot be recycled. One particular item can be considered recyclable in one district in one area of the state, when in another area that's using a different recycling system, it is not. So it really puts the burden on consumers to understand these kind of rules that change wherever you go. And obviously we're all too busy, you know, dealing with emails to keep track of all that. Then there's, of course, the aging recycling infrastructure. So, you know, like many things, our infrastructure is out of date. The bill would, you know, these EPR bills are meant to help provide funding to upgrade that infrastructure, improve the sorting systems, for instance, in the recycling facilities, in the MRFs. Then, of course, there's plastic pollution. I won't go into depth on this one. I'll do it a little bit later, but everybody knows the issues with plastic pollution, that the microplastics in our environment, as well as plastics on our beaches and elsewhere. And then the last one is the China National Sword Policy. So the China National Sword Policy, you know, even with all these issues that we're having, then in 2018, China banned the import of plastics, other recyclables, and set strict contamination limits. And so because of that, as this chart shows, there's a drastic drop in you know, recyclables imported to China, caused an excess of supply of the recyclable materials, and the prices of recyclable materials as a result plummeted. And you can go to the next slide. So we're going to talk now about the terms. You know, before we dive into SB54, you know, we wanted to just kind of make sure that we all have a good understanding of some of these terms that you'll see in EPR legislation. So the first one that admittedly tripped me up when I was first learning about EPR is the term covered products. Now, covered products, if you don't read carefully definition sections of these bills, actually refers to the packaging themselves. So it's not necessarily the actual product, you know, the bar of soap in a cardboard box of the soap container that contains the soap. It's the actual packaging itself. And at least for the California regs, there are two types of covered products. There's the single-use packaging. So single-use packaging will define it, but you know, that will be not only primary packaging, but also secondary and tertiary packaging. And there's plastic single-use food serviceware, you know, your utensils get from takeout, the Tupperware and whatnot. The other definition here is producers. So, you know, these EPR bills, they all define producers differently. So you really need to be careful from state to state what the definition of producers is. But for the most part, typically what you'll see in the EPR bills is that they'll define producers as really they'll follow the brand name. So as opposed to going after, for instance, the actual manufacturer of the packaging that a brand or, you know, will sign a contract with to use their packaging to package their product. They're not these EPR bills don't typically go after those, you know, packaging companies. They'll go for the brand. There are some issues here. So for instance, if you're importing from out of the country, often the import will be considered the producer or the distributor or even the retailer. So retailers and distributors, they're not necessarily, you know, not impacted by this bill or these EPR bills. The next one is producer responsibility organizations. So producer responsibility organizations, or PROs, they are also referred to as stewardship organizations. Now, this is kind of this major entity that is brought on by these EPR bills. And the PROs, it's a nonprofit that is put together by the producers. So the producers together form a PRO, and the PRO is then responsible for carrying out whatever's in the particular legislation. And we'll talk more about what that might be in the next couple of slides. Then there's the terms recyclability and recyclability. So you have to be careful here to understand what it means to be recyclable. And, you know, one of the issues that bills are addressing, and I understand also in California and their Truth in Labeling Act that has been passed already, has addressed this significantly, but is to make sure that what is being called recyclable, you know, when you see that chasing arrow sign, is actually recyclable. So the classic example would be the shampoo, the miniature shampoo bottle that you get at a hotel. That material is recyclable technically. It's, you know, that plastic material. But because of the size of it and its form, it would often be not captured in the recycle stream. It falls off the conveyor essentially, or the sieve, or what have you in the cooling system. So that technically would mean that the little miniature shampoo bottle is recyclable because of the form, not because of what material it's made of. Moving on to the definition of recycled, there's a push to have the term recycled also include using plastics for things like biofuels. And actually in the California bill we'll talk about, California excludes that option. They say that's not consistent with the definition of recycling. It needs to, you know, it cannot go to be used as a biofuel through like pyrolysis, gasification, or something like that. The next term I have here is eco-modular fees. So eco-modular fees, that just means it's the fees that the producers pay to the PRO to implement the plan, the PRO plan. And the fees are going to be based on the relative environmental impact that the packages have. So a material that is less environmentally impactful, something maybe that's compostable, will have less of a fee associated with it than something that, you know, it's just this giant piece of plastic to hold a typical, you know, chip. The next ones are pretty self-explanatory: lightweighting and right sizing. So, you know, just various ways actually to accomplish the next term, which is source reduction. And source reduction is just simply, instead of recycling, we're talking about just removal. So, you know, that reduce, reuse, recycle. I talked about truth in labeling already. And then the other one I wanted to touch on is post-consumer recycled content. So post-consumer recycled content, you'll just see it as PCR. That just simply means instead of using virgin plastic, for instance, you're using recycled plastic in your bottle. You can go to the next slide, please. So now we're going to jump in to the plastic pollution prevention and packaging producer responsibility act. Got that right? Just, you can call it SB54. So the act is centered around 3 goals for 2032. That is that, 1, all covered material that's sold or imported into California shall be recyclable or compostable by 2032. And mind you, that definition, you know, in the definition section in the last slide, we were talking about what is recyclable. So it's not going to be like that example of the shampoo bottle. They need to prove that they're recyclable, or adjust the recycling system so that their bottle is recyclable. Next one is a 25% reduction in the use of plastic packaging by 2032. And this one is interesting because a lot of the plastic companies were really pushing to have PCR, post-consumer recycled content, count toward that 25% reduction. And regulators said, no, it's not going to count. That's more for recycling. And so that will not be counted towards 25% reduction in the use of plastic packaging by 2032. Now, there's a few bills, SB54, that one, they might allow maybe 8%. I think I have it in another slide, but it's certainly not a lot. And then the other target for 2032 is 65% recycling rate for the remaining single-use plastic packaging by 2032. So I think right now we're probably around 10% in the state of California for single-use plastic or for our recycling rate. So we're, it's a pretty ambitious goal by 2032 to get that to 65%. You can go to the next slide, please. We touched this about, or we touched on this a little bit on the what is, or on terms, in terms of what is regulated under SB54. So obviously it's the single-use packaging. Again, that includes the primary, secondary, and tertiary packages. And then the plastic single-use food service ware. But I did want to note, and that's why I had this slide on here, is that there are some exemptions. So some exemptions would be packaging for medical products, infant formula, hazardous materials. And then interestingly, the beverage containers that are subject to California's bottle bill. So because those are regulated under the bottle bill, they are not being regulated under the EPR legislation. Now there is some, a little bit of detail to provide to that would be that, for instance, if you get one of the, like a 6-pack of soda with those plastic rings, those would be counted under SB54, but it's the bottle itself, that primary packaging, that would only be considered for the bottle bill. And then there's this other one with packaging for long-term storage products. I think they define it as 5 years. So things that like canned goods, for instance, will not be regulated under SB54. You can go to the next slide, please. So this slide, there's a lot of words here. We'll kind of go one by one here, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the responsibilities that both the producers, the PRO, government, and waste industry will be responsible for, or what their responsibilities will be under this legislation. So the producer responsibilities, of course, they need to register with a PRO by 2024 and pay fees to the PRO. They need to provide the PROs with their records to meet the reporting requirements. And just to kind of go off on a tangent here, one great thing about the bill is that it is very much data driven. There's going to be a lot of metrics involved in measuring and making sure that progress is being made. So there is some burden, though. It's going to be burdensome on entities like producers to have to collect that data, provide that data, as well as some of the data might be pretty sensitive information for their business. So although there is language that it's confidential, there's probably going to be some concerns and some kind of kickback from producers on these things. And one other note that I wanted to put in here is that there's sort of another exemption in our producers that was recently added, and that was so if the operator can, if the producer can show that or demonstrate exceptional recycling rates as defined in the bill, and I believe it's something like 65% recycling rate for 3 years and it goes up to 70%, then they do not have to operate within the PRO. And what will probably happen is that a lot of paper companies will meet that criteria. Moving on to going kind of the bottom left here is the PRO responsibility. So again, the PRO is just kind of group of the producers. So they are going to develop the fee structure to meet funding needs. The funding needs based on a needs assessment, which we'll get into when we talk about Cal Recycle. They'll need to submit the PRO program plan and implement the plan, provide the annual report describing progress, budgetary information, remit 500, and this is a big one. They have to remit $500 surcharge to a fund to mitigate the effects of plastic pollution on the environment and human health, primarily in low-income communities. So that was in addition to the bill. This is a fund in addition to the funding for upgrades to recycling infrastructure and making sure that the packages get recycled. This is addition to that, another $500 million per year, and it's for the next 10 years. So a total of $5 billion over 10 years. Moving on to the responsibilities of Cal Recycle. So Cal Recycle, the department, they're going to be in charge of rulemaking to implement and enforce the act. They'll need to prepare the statewide needs assessment. So there's going to be support by the PROs to conduct the needs assessment, but they are going to conduct a statewide needs assessment, at least one, I think multiple. They'll need to establish covered material categories. So basically defining what's going to be recyclable, not the waste characterization studies, publish recycling rates, and then review the PRO plans and reports. So just something to note as you see all responsibilities for the government is that it will be funded by the PROs. So in addition to the $500 million surcharge, the fees needed to operate the PROs and carry out the plan, they'll also need to pay administrative fees for Cal Recycle. Then the last one we have here is the recycling disposal facilities, kind of getting back into this kind of driven bill and kind of framework, is that they are going to need to submit information on disposal and recycling tonnages to the state. And you can go to the next slide, please. All right, so the PRO plan contents. So what we're talking about here is the action to address the needs assessment, right? The needs assessment that can be put together by Cal Recycle. So this will include technologies and written methods to achieve the recycling requirements. How are they going to be able to do this? It needs to be part of the plan. How will the PRO function, processing, recycling, and composting, including facilitating deployment of these technologies to improve identification and sorting, for instance. How will the PRO support the development of the viable, responsible end markets? So that's a big one. When we were sending our recycling stream to China, for instance, we didn't really have control of that stream once it went to China. And a lot of times, what happened is it didn't necessarily recycled. It could be incinerated, or it could just end up in a landfill or elsewhere. So what this, as part of this EPR bill that California came out with, the PROs are going to have to make sure that there are viable and responsible end markets for their materials. There's the PRO utilize existing collection programs and infrastructure. So it's not a complete overhaul of this. It's going to be using the existing programs, infrastructure, but of course, based on the needs assessment, there'll be some upgrades and some redistribution and reorganizing. Educating ratepayers to improve preparation and sorting of covered material. So this goes back to, no one has time to know what's recyclable and not recyclable. that's going to be a component of the PRO's requirements is going to be outlook or outreach to the communities. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so I just threw this slide in here just to put some other, I thought, noteworthy contents of the legislation. Some of this we mentioned, the term recycling, it does not include combustion, incineration, energy generation, fuel production. There's an exception for anaerobic digestion for the source separated organics, but for the most part, we're just looking at more mechanical recycling. Chemical recycling is also I think restricted in this bill, and there's those kind of things that some in the plastic industry actually criticize the bill about. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So then there's the owner. I thought this one was interesting. The owner operator of an online marketplace is not to be considered producer. And then the next one here, source reduction does not include switching from virgin covered material to post-consumer recycled content. That had some big pushback from the plastics industry, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And the PRO fee shall not be passed on to consumers as separate items or receipt or invoice. So that doesn't mean that the price of goods can't go up, but it does mean that they just can't have that line item for it. And we'll talk a little bit about that concern too in a little bit. You can go next slide, please. So this, the bill is about, I actually have it right here. I haven't printed it out here. It's probably not good of me, but it's 50, I think 7 pages long. It's a pretty chunky bill. There's a lot in there, but I kind of just boiled that down and created this visual here with a legislative kind of timeline for some items. So, on the top here, the source reduction, the key here is that there's a 10% source reduction with 2% through shifting to reusables. That needs to happen by 2027. And then in 2030, it goes up to 20%. And then in 2032, of course, that's that 2030 target, 25% source reduction with 6% through shifting to reusables. The recycling rate in 2028, it's going to be 30% plastic covered material recycling rate. Then it goes up to 40%. And then that 2032 date, it'll need to be 65% of that remaining plastic covered material. It'll need a 65% recycling rate material. So then things in kind of the near future that needs to be done is really a lot of things for Cal Recycle to sort through. Establishing the advisory board, that needs to be done next year. So the advisory board is I didn't touch on it in this presentation, but it's a board that has I think 10 or 12 members. I'm not sure exactly how many, but that will advise the PROs. So it'll assist them with formulating their PRO plan and it'll help review it prior to Cal Recycle review. Then in 2024, there's a list of covered materials, basically what's recyclable. That'll have to come out in 2024. Rulemaking is going to need to be completed by 2025, which it's not with all that is in this bill. They're going to be pretty busy from now to 25 for sure. Then we have in 2026 posting of recycling rates. And of course, in 2032, I just wanted to add, of course, that the remainder of packaging needs to either be recyclable or compostable. And you go to the next slide. So that was a lot. So I'm going to take a drink of water and we'll go into potential environmental impacts. And then we'll be ready for questions. I'm not going to go over this slide really, but I did want to have it here to mention that, you know, EPR for packaging, it's not new. There's a wealth of knowledge that we can get from the EPR for packaging programs in other countries, particularly in the EU and in Canada. And you can go to the next slide. So I wanted to bring at least one of them up, and you know, I bring up British Columbia's EPR performance because British Columbia is one of the older, had one of the older EPR legislation, and one of the older PROs. They're called Recycle BC, and so it's pretty well established, and it's good to look at for reference. So you can see here in this table, you know, unfortunately, I don't have California data to compare it to, but it shows here that recovery, for instance, for rigid plastic, that's 54%. And you know, for flexible plastic, 90%. But it's way higher than what we see in the U.S. The Recycle BC recovery rate was 78.1%, with 87.3% of collected materials successfully sold to recycling markets. Collection rates of plastic have outpaced general metrics. Outpaced generated with an overall plastic recovery rate of 42% in 2018, and with the 6% contamination across materials. So, I mean, basically, in essence, it shows that it works in terms of recovery rates, improving the recovery rates. The other item I don't have here on this slide, but I do want to bring up is that point about the potential for this to cause an increase in the price of goods for consumers. And what they've seen in British Columbia is that was not the case. Not necessarily saying that's going to be the same in the US and California, but what they saw was that about less than 1% per household item of an increase that they saw because of the EPR legislation. And you know, so basically, what the argument here is that these companies, they are not. It turns out they are not passing down the extra costs to the consumers, in part due to competition. Their prices down to beat out that competition. You can go down to the slide, please. So, you know, I want to talk about sort of some of the big problems that are associated with plastic and what this bill might do to impact and hopefully assist with these issues. So, cleanup and prevention of plastic pollution. You know, we all know the problem, like I said before, but you know, the widespread dispersal of microplastics. You know, microplastics being those 5mm pieces, or you know, in length, the size of a sesame seed plastic, and that they're everywhere. They're in our rainfall. They're in the water. They're in the oceans. They're in our drinking water. Then there's the plastic pollution on our beaches. 6 out of the 10 types of items commonly picked up during beach cleanups in California are single-use foodware. And you know, with all of those issues, taxpayers and local governments are spending over $450 million in ongoing efforts to clean it up and just to keep up with it. And you know, so you know, that's the idea of the EPR, to have some of that burden go to the producers. So you know, what's SB54's impact on this? Well, there's going to be another $500 million in funding a year to assist with these efforts. Of course, the source reduction is going to assist with these efforts. And actually, the Conservancy estimated that the legislation would eliminate 23 million tons of plastic in the next 10 years. So I think that was 26 times the weight of the Golden Gate Bridge in plastic a year. And you can go to the next slide, please. So then we have the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Now this one gets a little interesting. I'll go into it in the criticism section. But there obviously if there's 14% of oil. I'm just going to actually read out some of these facts here. 14% of oil is used in the petrochemical manufacturing. Plastics industry is expected to consume 20% of oil produced worldwide by 2050, and actually drive nearly half of oil and frac gas demand growth. The manufacture of just 4 plastic bottles releases greenhouse gas emissions equivalent to driving 1 mile in a car. The U.S. burns 6 times more plastic than it recycles. In 2019, production and incineration plastic added more than 850 million metric tons of greenhouse gases, which is equivalent to emissions from 189 5-megawatt coal power plants. So what's SB54's impact? Well, of course, source reduction, incentivizing reusable packaging, right sizing, and lightweighting. But one thing that I do want to talk to you out of experience at Geosyntec is the California market share is absolutely going to encourage producers to implement changes for packaging distributed nationally. When we were looking at the EPR bills coming out, we saw, the bills in Maine and Oregon, it was an alert, but everybody was looking at California and saying, if this one goes to EPR, we are absolutely going to need to make significant changes. And so because of California's market, it's going to have a great effect. I think it's most suitable to put here for greenhouse gas emissions. And you can go to the next slide, please. Of course, then there's the landfill issues. Our landfill are reaching capacity, and we need to improve our solid waste diversion rates. So, the state recycling goal of 75% of solid waste generated to be converted from landfill disposal, California is not looking like they're going to reach that goal. The plastics account for 12% of California disposed waste stream. Less than 15% of plastic generated in California is recycled. And the League of California Cities found more than 7 out of 10 cities. So basically, the majority of the cities anticipate having to increase waste collection rates by as much as 20% to cover costs of managing waste. So again, the idea is that what SB54 is going to do is it's going to have the producers share the financial burden of managing packaged products. And before I kind of leave this and the potential benefits of SB4, I do want to note that you see under SB4 impacts, it's pretty general. There hasn't been yet a lot of studies to really dive into what the specific impacts are projected to be from SB54. And I think that with time we'll see that, and we'll see certainly when the rulemaking is a little bit further along the road, and we have a better idea of kind of what's going to actually happen from this framework that the SB54 legislation brings. We'll have some better projections of the benefits from SB54 with regards to solid waste diversion rates, climate change, as well as dealing with the plastics environment issue. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so like I said, there are some critics of the bill from both sides. Some, for instance, I didn't mention it in this presentation, but styrofoam. Folks wanted an all-out ban on it. They instead placed restrictions on it for recycling, pretty harsh recycling, or say harsh, but difficult to obtain recycling requirements that may not be obtainable for styrofoam. But I wanted to point out one interesting one, and that is, or a couple of interesting ones. But something that the American Chemistry Council has brought up. They brought up three main concerns. One is the restrictions on the chemical recycling will make it difficult to keep hard to recycle plastic out of the environment and landfills, as well as meet demand for recycled plastic food grade applications. So they really wanted to use chemical recycling for this. They're concerned that without the use of chemical recycling, we're going to have issues with this. Two is the carve out. They call it the carve out for paper industry, will ultimately jeopardize the effective recycling system supported by all material inputs. I think that one's kind of just, they want the paper industry to be more involved. And then the interesting one is that the 8% cap on PCR, it could unintentionally incentivize use of materials with higher carbon footprint. So basically what they're saying is, you have a particular carbon footprint for a plastic-based package, and if you go something maybe heavier, you're actually going to have a higher carbon footprint. And you can go to the next slide. I'll give a kind of example of that. So this one is, look at, I'm into life cycle assessment. So if this is kind of has to do with functional units of life cycle, of doing a life cycle assessment. But if you look at comparing a glass bottle and a plastic bottle, if you look on a per kilogram basis, per kilogram of the material basis, the clear winner is glass. Even if you have 100% recycled PET, glass is still going to have a smaller footprint. But if you consider that the weight of the glass and the bottle, then actually the glass has a significantly higher footprint per bottle. So, and this just kind of, this study was done, they had some assumptions here that 85% of the glass was recycled, and I think for the plastic it was 50% incinerated actually, and 50% recycled. But you need to, if you think about life cycle assessments, you need to be careful, and when looking at with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, the bottle, the plastic bottle, some will argue is better than the glass. Now there's of course there's if you start reusing the glass, that changes. So there's debate to that as well. You can go to the next slide, please. So the key takeaways here are that the EPR for packaging in California is here. It's not a new concept. But there's these aggressive targets here that California is setting. All covered material shall be recyclable or compostable by 2032. 25% reduction in the use of plastic packaging by 2032, and then 65% recycling rate for the remaining plastic packaging by 2032. The SB54 essentially puts the burden on producers, and then proponents of the bill will believe that it's going to result in a reduction in pollution, reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and improving our recycling markets. And then, of course, the opponents are concerned that it's going to introduce using other materials that may have higher carbon footprints. And I think that's all I have. And we can go for questions. If not, I can show examples of some innovative, alternatives to plastic packaging. Time.
Thank you, Ross. Informative presentation. I came with a lot of questions, and you answered almost all. I just have one question, and I'm actually monitoring the chat section. I don't see any questions. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to add your questions in the chat section or raise your hand and ask your question. I'll go ahead and ask my question first. I was wondering, how would this bill affect e-commerce brands like Amazon? Would Amazon be responsible for all the packaging that they use?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question because one of the things that's noteworthy in legislation is that the owner or operator of an online marketplace is not to be considered a producer. Now, a third-party seller will be considered a producer. So I think they put that marketplace in there for addressing e-commerce. Also, and just one thing that applies to this as well as just everything in general in the bill, there is going to be some cleanup bills to follow. I can even see, there's language in here, they forgot the word not, and it totally messed up what they tried to say. So admittedly, even by the sponsors of the bill and the writers of it, they said it's not perfect, but it's what we got out, and there's going to be some cleanup. So I do think there's going to be some opportunities to do some tweaking, and I do think that's probably one of the areas that could be tweaked.
Thank you. And I see a question in the chat asking, how can consumers get involved or implementing this rule?
Oh, yeah. So there's going to be definitely, so as part of the needs assessment that Cal Recycle is going to be doing, going to be forums, they're going to be seeking public input, what needs to be done, what can be improved. I think certainly from, even my side, I'm, supposed to be an expert in what can be recycled and what can't. I get confused all the time as well. So I think there's a lot that Cal Recycle, that the PROs can learn from consumers, from the public, and it will certainly be a part of this process. So in the next few years, there's going to be opportunities for public input. I would suggest to go on Cal Recycle's website. They have a pretty good website. I've looked at various websites from different states. Cal Recycle's got a pretty good one. But they'll certainly advertise. Hey, we're soliciting public input for this. So just keep an eye on that.
Thank you. Okay, so in the interest of time, I will read one more question and we go to closing. So we have a question asking, do you expect vegetable wrappers that will be biodegradable to be a new packaging option?
This is a great segue. I do. I think so. What I'm most excited about, there we go. What I'm most excited about is the innovation that this could potentially bring, because really, like I said, the whole purpose of these policies is to kind of pull the levers to make producers want to be incentivized to sort of try new things. And so, there's all these new technologies out here, kind of through the idea of circular economy. And one of my favorite is this. It's actually an edible coating that I think this actually was a California-based company. I think it was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So I'm hoping that something like this would be kind of, really kind of hit the market and not be as difficult to find in your market.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you, everyone. I'll now turn it over to Oscar for closing.
Great, excellent presentation. A lot of good stuff. Thanks, Russ, for your time and doing this for us. Really appreciate that. We will be putting up the events page. If you look at the past event where the event was listed, that's where this presentation and the video will be also. With that, we'll close the webinar. Thank you all for attending. Really appreciate this. Thank you, Simon, for organizing this. And we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar that's coming up in September. It's going to be on order issues, and we'll make an announcement pretty soon next week. Right? Thanks again, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.